Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin. As a reminder, the Responsible Edge is a show about business practices that not only achieve results, but do so with integrity. So today, I was delighted to be joined by Aisling Connaughton. Aisling is a co-founder of a company called Cyd Connects. They're a strategic brand consultancy delivering social impact for purpose-led clients. They do a lot of work in the B Corp space and onboarding and working with their clients in order to adopt that ESG framework. So for anyone interested in B Corp, it's a really fascinating conversation that we've had today. In terms of what we covered, Aisling's got an amazing background doing all sorts of things all around the world relating to comms, marketing, and sustainability. So she's got a really interesting history that we go through. And we then really focused in on an article in Forbes that looked at the requirement from an ESG PR strategy perspective to adopt certain kind of key principles in terms of the way that we go about communicating our ESG credentials. Really interesting alignment with some of the work that we've been doing at the Anti-Greenwash Charter. If you haven't already, please do check out the work that we're doing over there. This is highly relevant to today's conversation. Just wanted to finish by saying a big thank you to Aisling for of course, giving up some of her time and to have joined us today. She was absolutely brilliant. We'll try and get her back on for another show. And just to finish by saying a big thank you to all of you for listening in. Again, as always, really keen to hear any feedback that you might have for either ourselves and the show or for Aisling herself. So please feel free to share comments with us or email us. But enjoy today's show and thanks for listening in. Aisling, thank you so much for agreeing to spend some time with me on this Wednesday morning and get involved with the Responsible Edge. It's we're delighted to have snaffled you for a show, so thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Aisling, as always, and I think I mention this on every show, but we always want to start with getting to know you as much as we possibly can. Now, we've got some guests who come on who literally take it back to it all began as a wee 3 or 4 year old and take us through the whole thing. Others maybe keep it a little bit more concise towards careers and academia, etc. Feel free to choose where to kick things off. But yeah, great to hear more about you.
Amazing. Well, so my journey, so I have a sustainability consultancy. So I co-founded it 4 or 5 years ago now. So we help businesses with their sustainability strategies and, various ESG frameworks like B Corp. But my career to sustainability was a bit unusual in that I often joke I'm a reformed greenwasher. So I spent years working, joking, not joking. I spent years working in the beauty industry where I worked for the biggest beauty brands in the world. So to go right back, I got my first job working at L'Oreal in 2005. I got my first job out of Ireland and my first proper job, and I was PR intern. And I arrived in London. I thought I'd made it. And I was PR intern there. And then I worked at Clarins, Estee Lauder companies, all these big beauty brands, which are absolutely rife with greenwashing. And after, over a decade in the beauty industry, I just thought, I can't do this anymore. There has to be another way of making money. And I ended up having a complete career change where I moved to tech and worked for one of the biggest tech companies in the world. I relocated to San Francisco. And then I relocated to mainland China, where I was communications director. And I could see that businesses that didn't have a sustainability strategy had a crisis strategy instead. I worked a lot in crisis communications. And so I came back to the UK and did a full-time master's in sustainability and retrained. And yeah, now I have my own business where I'm part of the solution instead of the problem, which is a bit more fun.
That was actually, for somebody, obviously I know you well and spent time looking at your LinkedIn, etc. You've done a brilliant job there of cramming this incredibly in-depth, detailed, vastly experienced sort of career that you've had into such a concise package, if you like. I've got to ask you, when you joined, as a PR intern back in 2005, it was L'Oreal, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
At what point was it immediately apparent to you that greenwashing was prevalent and an issue, or was it something that kind of grew in your consciousness over?
Yeah, and greenwashing wasn't really a thing then either, right? So you didn't really know what greenwashing wasn't a term. It only went into the dictionary when was it, like 2019, I believe it went into the dictionary. So it's a new term, greenwashing, meaning vague or misleading information about environmental or societal practices. So back then in 2005, the term didn't really exist. But at my first day at L'Oreal, it was also, which is very topical at the moment, it was also the same year that the Body Shop had been acquired by L'Oreal. And so we were all kind of brought up to the top floor, there's lots of different brands within L'Oreal, and we were all brought up to the top floor with this exciting news that L'Oreal had acquired the Body Shop. And the CEO kind of was giving this exciting news. And I was like, oh, wow, I love the Body Shop. This is amazing. Everyone from the Body Shop was crying, which I thought was a bit strange. You know, I was 20. I was like, why is everyone crying? I don't understand. Why are they so upset? They were literally crying because to them it felt horrific, right? It felt really sad that the Body Shop had been acquired by L'Oreal. And at that time, I mean, the greenwashing example in the beauty industry is, you know, this product hasn't been tested on animals, and they'll put a leaping bunny on it, but all the ingredients in the supply chain will be tested on animals, and then they'll mix it all together, and the lawyers will say, oh, because the finished product hasn't been tested on animals, we can sell it as not tested on animals, never mind all the kind of ingredients in the supply chain. And Anita Roddick, the founder of the Body Shop, had really held the beauty industry to account for that. And it was not aligned, I would say, with the big players in the beauty industry at that time. So that's kind of, you know, that was kind of the beginning of it, where I was like, hold on a second, this doesn't feel right.
And explain, that sounds super interesting. So that was just a sense of like, was that the first sort of observation of kind of ethical, responsible business, and how actually it was jarring for a company that had been founded on those principles to essentially be in an acquisition state, if you like. You talk about, I'm going to plot through your career, so we're going to leap a little bit, but talk to us about, so you then find yourself in mainland China, and you're doing, I want to pick up on, you said organizations either had a sustainability strategy or a crisis management strategy. Can you just go into a bit more depth and detail about, you know, what you observed there and what your work was like working in those two kind of distinct areas?
Yeah, so I was in China in 2018, and the reality for me of what we think is happening in China, the reality, our perception of what's actually happening in China is very different. So when I arrived in China, there were floors and floors and floors and floors of people working on the ESG team, like so many people sorting out supply chain transparency and trying to figure out how are they going to conflict minerals, looking at how they could recycle end-of-life products, etc. They were all over it. And also from a tech perspective, you know, coming from beauty, where it's very much around a bit kind of smoke and mirrors, right? You buy a beauty product similar to why you buy a fashion product. You're kind of escaping reality, and you're trying to, you know, you don't want to be thinking of anything negative. In tech, it's all around solutions. How can we create, and you'll know this, Charlie, how can you create a tech solution that is going to make money while solving some of the world's issues, whether it's environmental or societal? And that was very much the theme working in tech in China. It was nearly like, how can we, instead of make money by doing bad for people and planet, let's make money that solves one of the sustainable development goals and sell it back to the West. That was very much the gist. But going back to your question around, if you didn't have a sustainability strategy, you had a crisis strategy. Brands don't have anywhere to hide. Like, I remember I was working at Estee Lauder companies when Twitter came out, and it was that thing where we were like, what do we do with this? Do you know what I mean? We were like, where does it sit? Does it sit in PR? It was like the hot potato no one wanted. Does it sit with customer relations team? Where does it go? And suddenly consumers could ask a question and brands had to respond. And up until that point before, brands could hide behind advertising, or you just didn't have that one-way relation. You didn't have it wasn't a dialogue with a business, right? It was them putting out information and consumers swallowing it. And social media has a lot to answer for from a mental health perspective. But I think holding brands accountable and brands having to respond changed everything, right? And it suddenly means that their brand equity was at risk. You know, they had to respond to certain things. And I think suddenly a lot of those tweets would end up sitting in the crisis comms team going, how are we going to respond to this? How are we going to answer on the fact that we are animal testing, right? How are we going to answer about modern slavery? How are we going to answer on the fact that we're paying, you know, in the fashion industry, a woman in Bangladesh 3p a day or whatever it is, 3 cents a day? You know, suddenly we have to answer these questions, and it changed everything.
There's no hiding place.
There's no hiding place in the same way.
Mm. I mean, so you're working in China, and that's in 2018, and then you came back and did your masters. What?
Mhm.
I don't know if you mentioned this, but what was your masters in?
My master's was in social entrepreneurship. So I was really interested in this theme of, or this, the more so my brother's an environmental scientist as well. So I'd always kind of had him in my ear. And in full transparency, I'm from a really arty family. So my parents are actors. It's very bohemian. I was kind of the black sheep because I went and studied business. I was very financially driven. I was working from a really young age. My parents are in the arts. We were broke pretty much most of the time. I had 2 jobs from the age of like 13, 14. I was always working. I was very financially driven. For me, money equaled freedom. So I wanted to make some cash, basically. And that had always been kind of my driver. But then I realized, what is the purpose of a business? And you don't have to sit down and study sustainability for very long to realize that there's loads of problems, right? Like the planet's literally burning. People are being treated really unfairly, but they're not really problems. They're actually symptoms. And they're symptoms of this broken economic system. Because as a species, we have not figured out how to make money without exploiting someone or exploiting the planet. And that is the crux of it, right? So how do we make money? By doing good for people and good for planet. And that's why I really wanted to focus my research and time in kind of entrepreneurship. My area of interest is like where business and sustainability meet.
Mm-hmm. And that was sort of, you can very much see when you look at the timeline of your career that how the different influences knocked on to the next step, and how being in China and realizing the impact of the rise of the crisis management requirement then led you to go, there must be a way of us being able to, as you say, make money, but also do so in a way that's not detrimental to people, planet,
Yeah,
etc.
absolutely.
So I love that. Okay, and then coming up to now, and I'm sorry, I love how I've got very much fixated on all things Aisling's career, but I think it is really interesting. Cyd Connects. So what were the kind of founding principles, if you like, that when you were thinking about, okay, I love the reformed greenwasher term. I think that you're being harsh on yourself, but I really love that. What were the kind of things that you said, like at the core of what this business is going to do? This is what we want to ultimately enable for our clients. Just talk us a little bit about that.
So right at the very beginning, so when I went and was studying, so I took time out to study, I had like 3 clients, just so that I could do some work while I was studying and basically just make some money and feed myself. And so I set the business up while I was studying, and it just kind of took off from there. And I had worked with a woman called Jennifer for over 15 years in beauty, and she was always one of the smartest women I knew. She was also very, very outspoken in the beauty industry. So when our gender pay gap would be released in work, that often the report would be kind of pushed out on a Friday evening before on a bank holiday, where hoping no one would notice it. And she would always insist that HR would come in and report it to us. So she was, we'd always kind of kept in touch and seen if we could work together. Our values were very, very aligned. And so I would kind of pressure test my client work with her. And then it just started growing, and we just sat down and we were like, we do this properly. And she came on board officially. She left her full-time job and came on board as a co-founder. And what we did right from the outset was we B Corp'd our business. So when you first start a business up, you don't really know. We were like, there just has to be another way of using our skills. And so we're a fan of B Corp because we B Corp'd our business from day one. And it was really like a mentor, which helped us guide us and put us in the direction of where do you want to focus your energy and your time. So for us, gender equality is absolutely key. So we really, we're a big believer in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm personally neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD in 2017. I believe that we need different thinking and different ways of doing things to change society. And so, gender, race, neurodiversity, all of these elements together really play a part in our business. But for us,
Actually,
we offer, yeah.
So I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I want to pick up on this. And I hope it's okay. Again, we can cancel things out if you rather not talk about this, but that's fascinating. So you were just to pick on that, you were diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD. Was that right? In
That's correct.
2017. Yeah. So you've had, from my, again, putting things together, you've had this incredibly, impactful, successful career up to that point. Are you in China in 2017?
Yes, I will. So I was diagnosed, I was traveling between. So I had a
Okay.
global remit, but I was between China and the States at that time. Yeah.
Can you just explain? I mean, I imagine it'd be helpful for other people that are out there that are, that have got, these
Mm.
neurodivergent, diagnoses, and being inspired by somebody who's gone through and had a career up to the point of being diagnosed that's been that impactful, and then ultimately what you've gone on to do thereafter. Can you just talk us through like the experience of that, like how
Mm.
how you felt about the diagnosis, like how it impacted you, etc., etc.?
So yeah, for me, so I had a horrible time in school, really. So, because the dyslexia wasn't really a thing when I was in school. You were just a dunce. Do you know what I mean? It was just like, you're not very smart. And so I was always in and out of remedial classes, pretty much.
Right.
I was in a convent in Ireland. And so I was always kind of in and out of remedial classes. And then I just was like, I don't want to be in remedial classes anymore. So I just learned to cheat. So I cheated my way through my education pretty much, and did okay, but had a huge guilt. Do you know what I mean? You can imagine, like, I just had this, like, I was like, oh, everyone knows I'm not, or no one knows I'm actually really thick. And like, I've had to cheat and it's awful. You've all the Catholic guilt on top of that as well in the convent. Like, it was just a bit of a nightmare. And so I had this real belief that I wasn't very intelligent. And that's why I probably liked working as well. So I was always working, in school, but working at the same time. And then once I got into a corporate career, once I had a team, everything changed for me. So once I had a team, then I really enjoy, managing teams. I really value people's opinions as well, because people can often do things much better than I can. So I'm really like engaged with the team, and I was never a boss who was like, oh, I can do that better. I was like, wow, you can do that really well. So once I had a team, my career kind of grew and grew. And I'll always be grateful to the beauty industry, because I did walk in, as an intern at L'Oreal in my 20s, and walked out, however many years later, as communications director for the second biggest tech company in the world. So I'll always be really grateful that it lifted me the way it did. But I think my diagnosis came along because my boss was the chief marketing officer at this tech company, and she used to lecture at Cambridge University. And I used to go with her and write her presentation for her before she would lecture. And one of the professors at Cambridge University came up to me and said, if you are the one writing the presentation, you should be the one presenting it. And I kind of looked at her and went, it doesn't really work that way in corporate, but, thanks. And she was an incredible woman, but she said to me, she kind of became a bit like a mentor, really. And she said, are you sure you want to work for this tech company for the rest of your life? What do you want to do with the rest of your life? And I was like, well, I'd love to retrain, but I have a confession, like, I'm actually not really smart, and I'm not smart enough for academia, at all. And she really encouraged me to look at my situation differently. And she encouraged me to get a diagnosis. And that's such a scary thing to do, because, you really just believe you're not very smart, right? So then they go and have a whole load of different tests, and they go, sorry, we were just testing you wrong all along. That whole education system is just testing you wrong. Now we're going to give you a whole load of different labels. Take off your dunce hat. Here's a different set of labels. You're actually really smart. And then I got a scholarship to Cambridge, and then went on and did my master's, etc. So it is. It's, our education system is great in lots of ways, but it's improving. But I think my story isn't unique, and I think a lot of people have had similar experiences.
It's super helpful, Aisling. Thank you for sharing that, because I just think, like, I know we're going to come on at the end and talk about your bits of advice that you'd offer to younger self, if you like, but just to hear, the fact that. And in fact, let me ask, instead of rambling on, let me ask you a question on that. What changed for you in terms of your experience of yourself and of your work at the point at which, diagnosis was done? I know you mentioned a new set of labels, but like, what was the impact of that?
I think learning to play to your skill sets is the biggest thing. I mean, for me, it was a long process as well. Like, I did a lot of therapy, because it's not like, you can't tell someone they're stupid every day and then be like the next day, be like, oh, sorry, we got that wrong. You're actually smart. Like, the feeling doesn't change, like, I was like, the feeling takes a bit longer to like unpick, really. And I remember, I give this example of, I remember like waiting to go in and see my therapist, and there was a guy sitting beside me. And his story was that he had had a totally different schooling experience, where he had a really privileged upbringing, and his neurodiversity had been picked up when he was like 5, and he had been labeled a genius. And so he had this genius label instead, right? So where I had been given the dunce label, he had been given the genius label. And he had spent huge parts of his life really suicidal because he was not living up to his genius label and felt that he was a failure. And I remember that was the kind of change for me where I was like, you know what, labels just don't work. Doesn't matter if you label this or that. We all have different skills. Like we all have our brains work differently. That's the magic of humanity and the diversity of the human race. And, you know, we have different skills to bring. And I think when you figure out what your skills or your superpowers are, and you can play to those strengths and then get support where you need them, then that's where everything changes, you know.
I love that. I feel like we've already got like major bits of advice, you know, gleaned from you, Aisling. So that's really interesting. And I think just in terms of like our team and the building of it, it is that identification of the strengths of each of the individual and understanding that actually it's the patterning and the pulling together of different skill sets into that team dynamic that is so crucial. So I think that rings very true. Let me ask you that. I interrupted you to ask you about that when you were sort of crescendoing with the sort of founding principles and inspirations behind Cyd Connects. And I just want to tie into this question, like what, and I know the whole thing is related to this, but when you were thinking about the development of Cyd Connects, what role did kind of enabling ethical and responsible business practice, like what role did that play in your thinking of the formation of the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, in social entrepreneurship, the view is that if you have like on the right businesses that make money at any cost, right? So they're making money at shareholder primacy, they're making money at any cost, but they're unsustainable because they're ruining the planet and they're exploiting people. Then at the other extreme, you have charities, which are just doing good for people and planet, but they're also unsustainable because they're relying on money from the big bad boys, right? So the money dries up, then they die, basically. So what you really want to have in the middle is like a social enterprise, which makes money, but does good for people and planet at the same time and can grow sustainably, basically. So that was really much the principle for us. We were like, you know, for me, I think we have to change our mindset around money. Money is energy and it is power. And I think we need to figure out how we all make money and participate in this economy and do good with it instead of, you know, bad, basically. So we were like, the bigger we grow and the more successful we are, we want to ensure the more we're accelerating the Sustainable Development Goals. So our founding principle is to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. So we give a percentage of our time and our profits to always accelerating the SDGs, because we believe like the Sustainable Development Goals are great. And you know, again, when I was living in China, they were working to the SDGs and we were saying they were BS over here. But I was like, they are global goals. Like there's a lot of work that's gone into them. But they have two huge challenges. Like number one, low citizen awareness. No one's really heard of them. And number two, they don't do anything. You know, you have to actually you can't just put it on your pinboard, guys. You need to do the work. And so this is where business is a huge role to play, because we are the doers in society and we make stuff happen. And so that was kind of the founding principle for us. We were like, how do we accelerate the SDGs? How do we help businesses accelerate the SDGs and change the system?
I tell you what, you can tell that you do numerous speaking arrangements, because every response is just so perfectly poised and eloquently put. I'm going to ask you. This is something we might cut this out, but I was reeling this morning. I was scrolling through reels this morning, and Noam Chomsky came up and was talking about how, regardless of intention, when it comes to the way that we want to view new forms of business in the 21st century, and the idea of, you know, factoring in profit and purpose and planet, etc., and people all into the mix. The uncomfortable truth is that our economic system, our capitalist economic system, is built upon the fundamental principle of maximizing shareholder value. And ultimately he was making the claim that until we change that, until that is not the governing rule for the way that a corporation should behave, or the legal requirement for how a corporation should behave, we're gonna really struggle to make any sort of real definitive change the impact of our economic system. That was a very long-winded initial intro, but what's your take on that? Do you think that maximization of shareholder profit can still remain as a governing principle of the majority of entities operating in our economy, or do you think that is something that we need to fundamentally look at and evolve?
I think it absolutely needs to change. And I think if you look, again, if you spend a bit of time studying sustainability, or, I'm lucky enough to be a member of the UN Global Compact, so I go to all the world leading UN events. And here is the uncomfortable truth, Charlie. The uncomfortable truth is that if we all stop and really look at our current system, it has been built on colonialism and slavery. And that is the roots of our economic system, right? It has been built on taking something that doesn't belong to you and making money out of it. It's our linear economy, taking something from the planet, making a load of cash and having a load of waste at the end. Or literally, modern slavery still exists, exploiting someone in a supply chain, making money off them and making some people very, very wealthy. And the thing is, we have just dreamt up this capitalist system. It's a collective agreement that we've made. And, thankfully, times change, right? We're all growing, we're all evolving, we're all educating ourselves. We all believe that slavery is wrong now, hopefully. And so we can just all collectively dream up a different way of behaving, believing. And I think it's already happened. I think we need to move our capitalist system from a shareholder model to a stakeholder model. And that's why I'm such a fan of B Corp. It's why I'm a B Corp expert, because that is the whole premise of B Corp. And that's what makes it different from every other ESG framework, is that it is saying you make that legal commitment, because in America, the fiduciary duty of a CEO, if you were a C corporation, is to make as much money as possible for your shareholders. If you are not doing that, you can be sent to prison today. And so B Corp is saying we're going to move your business from a C corporation to a benefit corporation, which means that you legally commit on people, planet, profit, or keep all your stakeholders. And then how you deliver on that is through the B impact assessment. And there's a lot of great work happening here in the UK with the Better Business Act. And you have that spearheaded by Mary Porteous, where they're trying to have the Articles of Association updated so that when you set up a business, you have to take into account all of your stakeholders instead of just your shareholders. And I think then the system will change.
I love that. I have to be actually, for somebody who's not a B Corp kind of expert in any shape or form, the way that you've described exactly how the framework works in that way was brilliantly clear and understandable. So I'm sure that'll be helpful for listeners out there that are wanting to sort of dive into and understand a bit more about B Corp. As expected, our little format for our conversation today has gone wildly out of the window on the basis that I've been far too interested in posing questions about your career and what you've done so far. Can we, though, perhaps park and if we can encourage you to come back on for another episode at some point, we can do chapter 2 on all things Aisling. But could you perhaps just introduce us to the Forbes article that we previously shared with you, Aisling, and just provide our readers with a bit of an understanding of what was covered in that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So the article you shared was all around greenwashing within ESG, which is such a fascinating topic, right? It's in Forbes. I highly recommend everyone give it a read. But, I think what really interested me, because I obviously know about greenwashing before it was even named greenwashing. So, and this is where, I think the truth is even stranger. You can write this stuff sometimes, I often think. So do you know, Charlie, how PR began? Do you know the original beginnings of PR?
Take me back. Take us back. Yeah,
So, because I got my first job working in PR when it was actually pre-L'Oreal. So I was working in a hairdresser's, and this really glamorous woman used to come in, and I used to wash her hair. And I just thought she looked cool. I was like, she has her own company. And I just asked her for an internship. So her name is Caroline Kennedy. She still has her agency in Ireland. She gave me my first work experience job. I must have been about 16. So I went in and worked for her. But I didn't even know what PR was. Do you know what I mean? I was like, what even is PR? I just looked good. But basically, the origins of PR is fascinating because it actually begins with Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud is in the father of psychology, was with his family, explaining his theory that people move towards pleasure or away from pain. So he had this theory, people move towards pleasure or away from pain. And his nephew, who's called the father of PR, so if you look him up on Wikipedia, he's the father of PR. His name is Edward Bernays. And he was like, that's so interesting. God, that's really interesting. People move towards pleasure or away from pain. And he worked in marketing, and he was like, I can basically use that to get people to buy more stuff. And his kind of huge PR success was in 1929 when he convinced women to smoke, really. So all, this kind of thing around smoking helping you lose weight. He had a picture of like a woman diving into a pool swimming, and then a shadow of like an overweight woman beside her saying, "Will this be you in 5 years?" You know, I have a lucky strike. Let me say exactly what it said. It said like, exactly. It said, is this you 5 years from now? Reach for a lucky strike. And this kind of belief, you know, that like smoking helps you lose weight is still kind of embedded in a lot of people. You know, we still believe this, it's an appetite suppressant. And so he really played on women's insecurities, not just women, but everyone's insecurities, this kind of fear of being fat, unattractive, or you even see it with cars, you know, like cars, sex selling really began with him. And he's a book called Propaganda, which is also worth a read. So he was really kind of the root of PR, and also the root of manipulating people to buy things that they don't necessarily need, playing on their insecurities. And so that kind of fed then into greenwashing, right? Because greenwashing as well is like, you don't want to feel bad when you're buying something a lot of the time. You know, you don't want to feel like you're doing something bad. And so greenwashing really kind of plays on a lot of that. It's kind of an evolution of like your insecurities, I think.
That's fascinating. He's got a lot to. What was the chap's name? Sorry, just again.
Edward Bernays, Bernays. Yeah.
I will have a look up. He's got a lot to answer for, hasn't he? He's got a lot to answer for. It's really interesting in terms of because that's fascinating. Yeah, and you can see it play out in I guess all forms of comms. I guess in corporate comms, like everything is sort of geared towards, as you say, that kind of. Well, let me ask you this. So the article, I think, talked about how, you know, we we PR firms, professionals, etc., have got an opportunity with the work that they do, that if they do it correctly, and this kind of goes back a little bit to the Cyd Connects introduction that you did before, if they did it correctly, that actually, you know, real sort of effective, positive behavior change can be the result, alongside, you know, profitable outcomes, etc. Can you just touch on, with the article, like just some of those other themes that it covered in terms of the potential for PR to do good?
Yeah, and I do think, you know, and this is the thing, I do think change is happening. I think for so long, so the article really touched on the fact that we need like trust and transparency, right? So you need to be able to be truthful about what you're talking around. It really spoke around the Green Claims Code a lot of the time, which is that we need to be truthful and accurate in what we're communicating, not be ambiguous, you know, don't kind of have unfair comparisons. So, you know, if you're going to compare, make sure that they're fair, and also be able to back up your claims, you know, so be able to really back up what you're saying. And what the article really explained was that we don't need to be perfect. You know, we're in a really challenging time in capitalism, right? Where no business is perfect. Like I work in sustainability, I'm constantly judged. I eat meat. I travel back to Ireland all the time. Like my carbon emissions are atrocious. Like, you know, like people just say to me, you can't fly. Like there's lots of things. I do buy fast fashion sometimes. Like we live in a really difficult, challenging time where, you know, we can't just go and like not participate in society as well. You know, if you're going to participate in society, you're going to have some of these challenges. Businesses are the same. And so instead of lying about it, being really honest about your communications and going, actually, this is a challenge we're having as a business, and this is what we're doing to address it and fix it, and not trying to cover it up. And I think for so long, and you'll know this, Charlie, so much of marketing has been like, you know, shouting about things that aren't true. And so that you can't get away with that anymore. You really can't. So it's around, you know, being transparent. And it's always that line we say with greenwashing when we support our clients, because you don't want to green hush, you don't want to greenwash. You have to walk this middle line. You need to have a leadership position. If you have a leadership position, at some point you're going to get cut down. I think businesses often greenwash with really pure intentions. You know, there's some negative offender. There's some offenders out there who are just trying to make some cash. There's some businesses who are really trying to do the right thing and accidentally greenwash. So it's never straightforward. But I think putting the time and effort into trying to get it right is key.
That's super interesting. Actually, I'm going to pick up on a couple of things there. I think the first thing to say, it's fascinating what your point about that, acknowledging where we need to improve as organizations, like the impact that can have on the sympathy, if you like, that you get from your stakeholders more broadly. Like you're not given a pass. These things are still areas that you need to improve, but at least you're acknowledging that these are areas that improve. And from a PR and a crisis comms perspective, if you've got that kind of publicly available, it means that you've always got that as sort of a caveat, if you like. It's something that we actually, with the work we're doing with the Anti-Greenwash Charter, our green claims policies templates actually include now a section which is where we could improve. And we encourage all of our signatories to essentially, detail these are the areas where, as an organization, we know that from an environmental perspective, we could be doing better. And these, as you say, are the areas that we think we should, what we're doing in order to further the agenda. So I think I couldn't agree with you more, that by doing that, it softens everything in terms of the perception of the organization. Let me ask you though, I wanted to pick out with this. We've obviously spoken a little bit about greenwashing and how to go about kind of addressing it. In your experience of working not just with Cyd Connects, but previously, like, what are the ultimate risks? If you've got organizations out there like who are kind of considering, the way that they're approaching their comms, etc., and perhaps concerned about greenwashing, like, it would be great to clarify from your perspective, what are the key risks of greenwashing, and are those risks evolving and developing as greenwashing becomes more and more kind of substantiated, if you like?
And this is where I think, having an ESG framework or knowing, having a stake in the ground, because like, if you think, for example, at one point, plastics were a great invention. Okay, so at one point in our timeline, plastics were a great invention, but we kind of made a huge mistake where we didn't think about the end of life. So I remember, my mum would say, oh, it was great. Like before, you just have glass smashing all the time. Suddenly you had plastic, and like, it was like Tupperware parties. But she was like, we didn't think about the end of life. And then we're in this big mess, right? So you have to move with the times. At one point, they were a great invention. Now they're not. It's a very extreme example, but it happens with everything in sustainability. Sustainability, I will say, is like tech. It's constantly moving. What you were doing yesterday is not good enough tomorrow. And that's really challenging. And it's one of the challenges we have with B Corp as well with our clients, because the B Corp standards are constantly evolving and changing. And our clients say to us, but you're changing the goalposts. It's really annoying. Like, well, we've just done this, and now you're saying we have to do this. And it's like, yeah, that's the whole point. It's called evolution. Do you know? It's like, and it is challenging. And I think bigger businesses that are big ships that have a lot of where it's hard to get things signed off and changed, they have to become more agile and be able to move faster. It's often smaller businesses that can make changes. So I think, knowing yourself, having your own kind of framework, knowing where you are, knowing where to focus your time. And that's why this new legislation that's coming out of Europe is called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So any business that's turning over more than 50 million and has more than 150 employees has to report now. So they have to say, how much money did I make? And then how have I impacted people and planet? And it's looking like that policy is going to be aligned with GDPR. If you don't do it, you're going to get really fined. And it's starting with bigger businesses. But by 2027, 2028, it's going to be any business turning over more than 8 million or businesses that are selling into Europe. And so this is really saying it starts with a double materiality assessment, which means what are the material issues in your business? So what are the issues in your business that are material to the world? If you're Evian, obviously it's a huge plastics issue, right? For me, in my business, I have a very low environmental footprint, as do you, Charlie. So that's not a material issue for us. And then the double aspect would be when, not if, when the planet turns on us and is going to affect us, how is that going to affect your bottom line? So if you look at ski seasons, they're obviously getting shorter and shorter and shorter. That's affecting the bottom line for ski resorts, right? So if there's a drought or whatever's going to happen, how's that going to affect your business? So every business is looking at the double materiality assessment, and then we'll unlock what they need to do from an ESG perspective. And I think businesses need to know themselves what's going on in their own business. And then once you've got that, then you can start communicating. Because otherwise you're doing it backwards, where you're trying to talk around something and you don't really know, you've got to look inwards first before you can talk around anything else. Does that make sense?
And that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of, I guess, we're talking about some of the partnership work that we're doing. And I think that's a really interesting alignment there. Let me ask you though directly, in terms of, you mentioned GDPR there. Obviously, there's a fining function with GDPR if we're found to be fall foul of it. What are the likely implications of getting things wrong in terms of the reporting that you've just described? Like, are we talking fines here? Are we talking other kind of issues around reputation, etc.? Like, what's your take on the major risks?
And you know what? We don't know yet, if I'm really frank. Like, we don't know. So this has just come into effect this year. So this is the first reporting year in 2024. So businesses have to track and measure this year and then give their report at the end of this year for 2025. And so then businesses will be reviewed there. So we just don't know what it's going to look like yet. But a huge part of this for the EU is around mitigating greenwashing. It's a huge aspect for it, and they've called it out as well. It's really, greenwashing really is such a challenge for the world, really. I mean, carbon neutral, carbon negative, carbon positive. Do you know what they mean?
I've got very spurious kind of definitions coming to mind, but yeah, there's a lack of consistency, isn't there, in terms of use of definition for particular terms? Exactly. Yeah. Actually, super interesting. Let me ask you, one of the things that the article touched on is the role that stakeholder engagement can play in building kind of successful ESG PR strategies. Can you just touch on, and I guess perhaps allude to some of the work that you guys do at Cyd Connects? Like, what role can stakeholder engagement play, and what does it look like doing it well?
And that's the whole thing. Like, what are your business's stakeholders? So when we touched on shareholder primacy, right? So often businesses, they've gone, the purpose of the business is to make as much money as possible for your shareholders. Actually, it's not, right? That's not what it's about at all. It's often about serving your customers. Your customers are a key stakeholder. The environment's a stakeholder. Your local community. Are you buying from your local community? Are you supporting your local community? Are you polluting your local community? Or, your community is a stakeholder. How's your business governed as well? And then how are your workers treated? So they're the kind of main 5 stakeholders, but every business has its own set of stakeholders. So if, my background's in PR, if you were in PR, journalists would be a key stakeholder for you as well. So it's about mapping out who are your stakeholders in your business, who are you impacting? And then how are you supporting them and serving them? And how are they engaged in your business? Right? So are you asking them for their views, their guidance? If you are with your customers, how do you engage with them? Can they have a dialogue with you? Are you getting back to them? Some businesses have literally been created to rip their customers off. I've had so many fights with my gym. Do you know what I mean? The whole gym model is often around, you signing up for a subscription. How many subscription models have we had where you don't use the service? You are not taking your customer stakeholder into account if that's how you're growing your business. And that way, that's unethical business, and it's not how business should be going forward. If we're talking about that systems change that you touched on earlier, moving businesses from a shareholder model to a stakeholder model, ripping your customers off, old way, old paradigm, not fit for purpose.
So here. Once we've, essentially, if I was to summarize what you just suggested, it's almost like creating that dialogue and that opportunity for dialogue between, well, firstly, identifying your stakeholder groups, which will be, as you say, unique to your business and what you're doing, but then ultimately find out ways of creating meaningful dialogue paths between yourself as an organization and them. Once we've sort of, set up those opportunities for engagement, what are the inferences that insights from your stakeholders can then have specifically on your kind of ESG PR strategies? What are the sorts? Give us what are these sorts of examples of the things that we might learn that we might then affect the way that we, essentially share our narrative around ESG?
Yeah, and I think it's twofold, right? So I think, an example, if you listen to your customers and hear what they have to say, if the beauty industry had listened to its customers, it wouldn't have needed Anita Roddick to say, we don't want our products tested on animals, thank you very much. Thanks, but no thanks. And so hearing from your customers firsthand is really key and taking it on board. I think, but also I think businesses have an education piece, and I think an education piece, a change around changing consumer behavior, because I think most consumers, and I, for a long time, I'm in the space full time. I didn't come to it. I know other guests you've had on had real kind of love for the environment. That came much later for me. I was a city girl. I grew up in New York, Dublin. I hadn't spent a lot of time in nature. I found nature much later in my life. And so I didn't have that connection with nature that lots of people do. And because of that, the environment wasn't really of interest to me, if I'm really honest. And so it is now, but it wasn't then. But I think there's an education piece around what are greenhouse gas emissions, what is carbon, what is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, how are we responsible as consumers instead of it being pushed onto us with like carbon offsetting, etc. I think businesses taking a leadership position and going, actually, do you know what I mean? This is why you need to turn things off. This is why it's key. This is what a greenhouse gas emission, the carbon makes up 70% of it. That's why we're all talking about carbon. All of that, I think people are going to have to learn and know. And I think eventually we're going to get carbon taxed. I think that's what's going to happen in the future. I think we're going to start tracking and measuring, and then businesses are going to have to reduce as much carbon as they can. And then I think polluters are going to pay more. I think that's the way it's going to go. So I think an education piece, twofold, it's a dialogue, listening to your consumers, your stakeholders, hearing what they have to say, but then also like businesses saying these are our challenges and educating too.
Super interesting. Aisling, I feel like you've just provided our listeners with like a stop safe kind of strategic approach, if you like, to all things ESG and the PR strategies that originate that develop as a result of it. I want to talk a little bit about I know we've touched upon Cyd Connects, we've touched upon some of the B Corp work that you guys do, but taking or considering some of these kind of principles that the article covered in terms of PR and how we as sort of from a comms and PR perspective, like how we need to make sure that we're accountable and that we're honest and fair and truthful, and the mechanisms for doing so. Can you just talk about that in relation to the work that you do at Cyd Connects, and perhaps touching upon the B Corp framework as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I would also just like to say, the big UN boss called out PR agencies a couple of years ago at the UN General Assembly, where he was like, we have to call out PR agencies who are shielding our fossil fuel companies. And there was a lot of controversy with Havas, who are a big agency who signed Shell and they're B Corp. So the premise with B Corp is that you have to, you can't work in certain industries unless that they're really trying to make change, etc. So Havas being a B Corp and then working with Shell, not okay, because they're protecting Shell. It's not the right thing at all. And so there's a lot of controversy in that area. So I think that businesses need to, I think it's having that mindset change, right? So if you even look at like Apple had an ad recently, which I'm not sure if you saw, which was around they invite like Mother Nature to their board meeting. I highly recommend everyone has a look at it. Yeah, so they invited Mother Nature to their board meeting, and they go through all of like what they're doing from an ESG perspective, and of course Mother Nature is really happy with them, and bravo Apple is the gist of it. But it's a really clever ad, and even though we work with lots of businesses that actually do put Mother Nature on their board for real, like they have someone who comes in and has legal rights, Faith in Nature would be one, Patagonia would be another business, and they actually put Mother Nature on their board. Apple didn't do that. They obviously just made a funny ad about it. But it did make me excited that they're using, they're the marketing experts and that they have the best minds in the world suddenly making ESG marketing or content relevant and interesting and fun. And I was like, if we can use these creative minds, like Edward Bernays, going back to him, he used his kind of PR skill to get women to start smoking. We can also flip it the other way and, use it for good and to kind of change the world and do really positive things. So I think it's just about, if you are one of those like marketing experts going, actually, how can I use my creativity and my expertise in a really positive way instead of like protecting businesses that are doing bad?
Actually, can I just pick, I think that was absolutely central, and I couldn't agree with you more. Let me ask you, like, is there I think Havas is, when the whole controversy came out, their sort of response was, look, we want to be part of the change. If we work with Shell, we've got an opportunity to influence the narrative, influence the messaging, etc., and that can ultimately have the kind of influence that you've just described. And also kind of with your B Corp hat on as well, thinking about the integrity of the framework, like, what's your take on that?
So a really good friend of mine works at Shell, a really, really good friend of mine. She's a really good person. She's, works in the ESG team. She really wants to do the right thing. She could hire me to come in and do training at Shell. If I did that, I would lose my B Corp certification. My business is a B Corp, right? Because I have committed that I'm only going to work with businesses that, like, if Shell make a commitment to put to change, if Shell say, okay, we're an energy company and we're going to change the way we create energy, and only we have our phase out plan, etc., then they could probably become B Corp certified. B Corp would work with them on that, right? They're not there at all. Right? It's very much shareholder primacy for fossil fuel companies. And until that, so I think if Shell want to make that change, then we can all work together, but they're not, so it's a really fine line, and I often say, like, you can't really, like, you have to be inclusive. We have to bring everyone on the change. You can't cut like sectors out, etc. You have to kind of, like, I give the example of, like, imagine going to a therapist and them saying, oh, you're just too messed up. You're not going to work. There's no hope. Do you know what I mean? I sometimes think like that for fossil fuel companies, like, we need to kind of work together and bring everyone on the journey. But unfortunately, like, money and power go hand in hand, and they hold all the power, and they are, like, not giving it up. Do you know what I mean? They're holding on tight, and they don't want to release that power and greed. But I think it's going to happen eventually.
It's that intention, isn't it? It's why Shell have chosen to approach or to appoint, a B Corp agency in order to work with, and the implications of that, with having not shown the intention, as you've described, to fundamentally change the way that their business operates. Really interesting. Actually, I could literally just carry on. I've got a list of questions, but we've kind of got towards a good stop point there. Always like to finish each show by kind of asking for your, not necessarily number one, but just like a core bit of advice that you would have offered perhaps to your younger self or to any of our young listeners out there embarking on their professional careers that would aid them.
Okay, I have loads of advice. So I think I was thinking about this throughout. So I think the first bit of advice I would say is, when I first started working, I used to think that people more senior than me kind of knew stuff that I didn't know. Do you know what I mean? So I'd be like, oh, like, there must be a reason. Like, I remember, like, challenging certain things in work and being literally just told to shut up, little girl, and that I didn't understand business. And I would be like, oh, okay, maybe I just don't understand business, really. And then the more senior I became, I was like, oh, actually I do. There's no secret kind of thing happening. So if something doesn't feel right for you, it often isn't. Do you know what I mean? There's an inner knowing. So I think have a bit more confidence in your kind of beliefs and your knowing. I would also say one of the successes of my career was, someone said to me once very early on that feedback is a gift. And I really took that on board. And I have a real belief that feedback is a gift. So if people give me the time to give me feedback, I take it on board and I digest it really well and move on. But in later life, and this is thanks to my co-founder, Jen, not all feedback is a gift. I'm sure you feel like this, Charlie. So some feedback you can take, but you don't actually have to take it on board. You can go, that's their opinion, and we'll just leave that gift over there. I'm deciding not to take it as a gift and just leave it. Everyone can have their opinion, but it is about going back to, again, your inner knowing and what's right for you. So kind of feel out, is it a gift? Is it not?
So I've now got this analogy of like a load of unwrapped gifts, like sitting in the corner of the room, which I love. How do you go about, what's your experience of acknowledging or understanding what gifts to open and which to leave in the corner of the room? Like, what are the judgments that go on?
I think you need to, like, sit with it a bit. So I think you need to go, I think anyone who's giving you the time to share their wisdom or their insight or whatever, I think you should always take really graciously, right? And feedback is hard to hear, and we often don't like receiving it. But I do think all receive it graciously, but you don't have to act on it. So I think you can then go, actually, do you know what? Maybe this wasn't the right thing for me. And I think at the beginning, of setting up a business, I would kind of, people who were more senior than me, I would often take on what they were saying and kind of pivot and change. When in fact, you don't have to make the changes. You can just go, that's their opinion, but this is mine, and I'm going to go this way. And the other thing I would say is don't be afraid. So one of the things I've done is chopped and changed career, right? I worked in beauty for ages. Then I worked in tech. Then I retrained in sustainability. That came very naturally to me, probably because I'm neurodivergent. It was very easy for me to make that change. I think other people find that quite challenging. And I would say our skills are so transferable. I often don't realize how transferable our skills are. And I'm here to tell you they are so transferable. So if you are working, we often just fall into a job because we need to make cash or we need to pay the bills. Take the time to take a weekend out and go, what industry or sector would I really like to be working in? What really kind of lights me up, turns me on? And then you can, pivot into totally different sectors, and maybe you'll try it and you won't like it and you can try something else. So I would say, don't be afraid to make those changes. There's a lot more opportunity out there than you realize.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. And what I love is when we ask people these kind of bits of advice or feedback they have people, often we get similar sort of stuff. But I think you've nailed 3 newbies for us there. So yeah, really great stuff. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time this morning and joining us for an episode. If it hasn't been too much of a horrific experience, we'll probably try and snaffle you for another one later on down the line. But we can talk about that afterwards. But thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Charlie.